Good afternoon, and welcome to the June version of Speaking of Art. Rebecca Albiani, you know it's going to be a good talk. Picasso and Matisse, you know what influence they had on 20th century art, and it should be fun to find out what influence they had on each other. So here's Rebecca.
Matisse and Picasso, then being introduced to each other by Gertrude Stein and her brother, became friends, but they were enemies. End quote. Gertrude Stein. Matisse and Picasso were very different people at the beginning of the 20th century. Matisse, nearly 12 years older, was a family man living in the suburbs of Paris with his wife, eventually their 2 sons, but also his daughter from a previous liaison whom he was raising. Matisse started his career as an artist a bit late after having gone to art school and sneaking in art classes as a law clerk, whereas Picasso was practically born with a paintbrush in his hand, son of an art teacher. And Picasso at this time is the lone wolf, the sexual adventurer living in the rackety Bateau Lavoir in Montmartre with the poets and the madmen. So temperamentally, they were not perhaps meant to be very close friends. Because he was the elder, Matisse was ahead on the road towards the most radical kinds of modern art. And in 1905, Matisse was, as he put it, learning, quote, how to make my colors sing, end quote. Here he's playing with the Renaissance convention of the painting as a window, a creation of 3-dimensional space, illusionistically. So there are things here that look like we are seeing perspective lines, and yet Matisse counteracts any sensation of deep space with the thickness of his paint and the brilliancy of his colors, so that these sailboats seem to be no farther away from the viewer than those flower pots that are in a kind of illusionistic niche there. But really, it is all on the surface. That is what 20th century painting does, is acknowledge that painting is a flat surface covered with colors. Matisse's most important work up until this time had been luxe, calme et volupté. Luxury, calm, and voluptuousness, sensuality. The lines come from a Baudelaire poem. And here you can see him as a pointillist, as he was early in his career, but the colors are much more arbitrary, less naturalistic than those of Seurat or Signac, the originators of that style of painting in little dots. Matisse was inspired to paint this by a picnic he had on the shore with his wife. That is Amélie there. But obviously he adds some other elements, and those are principally the female nude. Now, Matisse and Picasso are constantly aware of the whole span of the history of art when they are painting. So Matisse is thinking about the picnic on the grass, thinking about Manet's luncheon on the grass that launched Impressionism. He's also thinking about classical antiquity, that figure on the right with her hair above her head comes from a classical Greek statue of a form known as the Venus Anadyomene, the Venus drying her hair, that is known in a number of Roman marble copies, and here we see was being used by 19th century artists. But of course, Matisse takes all of these inspirations and puts them together in an entirely novel way with these clashing, brilliant colors that led him and his followers to be dubbed fauves, or wild beasts, by the critics. Picasso at this point is just coming out of his blue period, an era in which he paints the down and out, this ascetic, a blind guitar player, and so forth. Everyone in Picasso's blue period is gaunt, expressionistic, rather depressing. And these works didn't sell terribly well until he began incorporating pink and blue in his so-called rose and blue period, and eventually his rose period. And he began focusing on the lives of the performers that he met on the outskirts of Montmartre. These were circus performers, acrobats, dancers, and so forth. And he works their lively costumes and gestures into paintings that began to sell rather well. The Harlequin at the left with that diamond patterned garb, the Harlequin, when you see him in Picasso's art, is also an alter ego, a stand-in for Picasso himself. Now, this painting, The Family of Acrobats with an Ape, caught the eye of an American living in Paris, hoping to make a career as artist and critic. This was Leo Stein, who saw in the works of this 23, 24-year-old artist the glimmerings of genius. The Family of Acrobats brings together the blue and rose period with references to Renaissance art. So he's updating the Madonna and Child theme. The paintings done by Leonardo and Raphael of the Holy Family, St. Joseph, Mary, Jesus, but here in the guise of these acrobats with, of course, the ape looking on so tenderly. This may be a reference to Darwin, to the idea that there is a close connection between humankind and other primates. If you look at the hands, you'll see that they too are quite similar between the ape and the family. So this is a rich painting, and Leo Stein was right to see its genius, to buy this work. Within a few months, Picasso's Boy Leading a Horse had been added to the Stein collection in the apartment that Leo shared with his sister Gertrude. This is a more somber work, a more monumental work, 7 feet plus high. And you can see Picasso in a traditional way modeling form to give us, even with the black outlines, we get a sense of monumentality, of massiveness, of form in this work. But before he had purchased this, Leo Stein saw this work exhibited in Paris in 1905. This was the laughingstock of artistic Paris. This painting, Woman with a Hat, caused the critics to go into just paroxysms of hostility. The colors in the face were so bizarre. The difficulty in reading the forms of the hat or the fan across the chest, the splotches on the wall behind the model, whose colors are then repeated in the model's face. There was so much derision about this work that a group of conservative artists actually, as a joke, sent Matisse a model for a live drawing session that they had painted a green stripe down the center of her face. Matisse responded by painting, this portrait of his wife, which, if you remember that first slide, is actually quite a good likeness of Amélie Matisse, but it's become known as the green stripe. But at any rate, Leo Stein went home and thought about this painting. It stuck with him. And then he decided to buy it. Not least because if it was making that many people that angry, he thought there had to be something to it. So Matisse is experimenting with the portrait in 1905 with color that is non-naturalistic, and he was also absolutely obsessed with Cézanne. He saw this painting in Ambroise Volard's window, the famous art dealer, and he scrimped and he saved until he could finally purchase this. Cézanne, for Matisse, is important in his exploration of themes from classical antiquity, the bathers, of his exploration of the human figure in a way that is, on the one hand, sinuous with arabesques, but also awkward. And that awkwardness is something Matisse would explore. The relationship of figure to landscape, all of these things, Matisse is looking at in Cézanne as he creates his most radical painting yet, a work that he called The Joy of Life. Now, if you thought the woman with a hat was weird, welcome to The Joy of Life. These are figures that are mauve and orange and bright yellow. There are bizarre shifts of scale in this painting. The piper in the foreground looks to be on the same plane as the embracing figures, and yet is much smaller than they are. There are the tiny little figures in the background that are circle dancing, a motif that will become quite important to Matisse. And I want to point out in particular, it's a little hard to do with all of these. No, this isn't very strong. I think this needs a new battery. Well, okay. Two figures in particular that are going to be very important within this Matisse-Picasso rivalry. The standing woman at the left with her arms up over her head, and the reclining woman in the center right with one arm over her head. That one arm form comes from a Roman sarcophagus in the Louvre depicting Ariadne there in the lower right, and it signifies in Roman art a sleeping figure. Ariadne's been abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos and has fallen asleep and is about to be discovered by Bacchus, Dionysus. Renaissance artists took that Ariadne form and created the genre of the reclining nude. Giorgione and Titian and their followers. So these are Matisse's influences as he is trying to create an entirely novel, modern, Arcadian painting. Well, Matisse and Picasso had not met yet, but Picasso responds to The Joy of Life because the Steins purchased it. So he's seeing it at their apartment. And he painted his nude combing hair as a response to, a first response to the joy of life. It too takes on that theme of Venus drying her hair, here seen via Titian. It is in many ways one of Picasso's most Matisse-esque works, a work about sensuality and the tradition of the female nude. But when we look at this Picasso and then we look again at the joy of life, we can see what a truly radical painting this was. And Picasso spent the summer of 1906 in Spain. He used to return to Spain every summer. And in Spain, thinking of how to respond to Matisse, he sees Catalan Romanesque art, which is quite stylized, but he also starts looking at Iberian sculpture that was being carved on the Spanish and Portuguese peninsula pre-Roman conquest there. And those sculptures tend to be very stylized, what we would call so-called primitive, with those almond eyes that we see in this portrait. So here, there is no pure color. The only bit of pure color is a splotch of red on the palette. The rest is all mixed, mixed with black, mixed with white to create grays and buffs. That same summer, Matisse painted himself. And he is still working with brilliant and non-naturalistic colors in his flesh tones, lots of green still, lots of other colors animating the background. And if we look at these works side by side, and this is about their relative scale, we get a hint of the directions in which these two artists are poised to go and how they will diverge. By this point, the Steins have introduced them, but Picasso was at a disadvantage because his French was still dreadful. So Matisse, the former law student, could hold forth on anything, symbolism, light, color, while Picasso sulked in the corner. And yet one thing that interested Picasso that Matisse brought to the Steins was this little figurine. Matisse saw this and purchased it. It's from the Vili culture of the Congo. It is a seated figure with a sort of, hands up to something like a globe in its mouth, as if it is either eating or disgorging something. And Matisse showed this to Picasso. This was Picasso's first up-close look at African art, which would be tremendously important for both of them. For Matisse, it's about simplification of form. But for Picasso, he will begin a radical exploration of African art that for him is more about what he called exorcism, making art that has talismanic power. Well, since their French was equally bad, Picasso and Gertrude Stein formed sort of an alliance in the Stein corner, and Picasso offered to paint Gertrude, something Matisse never did, which might be why Gertrude Stein ended up so firmly in the Picasso versus the Matisse camp. Picasso, however, had a great deal of trouble with this portrait. Gertrude Stein sat for it 90 times. And when Picasso left for Spain in the spring of 1906, when he thought it was done, and then he saw a new work by Matisse and scrubbed out the face yet again, it was still incomplete. when he returned from Spain, where he'd been looking at that Iberian art, he painted in the face from memory and presented it to Stein as a gift. So it has those same rather almond eyes as we saw in the Picasso self-portrait. And this is a really important work for both Picasso and for Stein. For Picasso, it showed him how clashing styles within a single work of art could make an aesthetic statement. The mask-like look of the face contrasts with the more conservative treatment of the hands, of the garment that Stein is wearing, and suggests that within this bourgeois female body is an unknowable sphinx-like intellect. It's also androgynous. Stein was a lesbian who felt that her genius transcended the limits placed upon her at this time by her sex. So for her, she enjoyed this dichotomy between the inner and outer selves. And when people complained that it didn't look like Gertrude Stein, Picasso objected, "Never mind. In the end, she will manage to look just like it." Stein immediately hung it on the wall of their apartment, right on top of the woman with a hat. So Picasso continues in this vein of those sculptural, simplified figures inspired by African art and by Iberian sculpture. If you look at the study on the right, it almost has an Easter Island feel to it for the two nudes, this massive pair of females. And Gertrude and Leo were not the only Steins in Paris who were collecting contemporary art. So this painting was intended for their brother Michael and his wife Sarah Stein, La Coiffure, which Picasso was painting in a subject that was very popular in late 19th century academic painting. For instance, it is the subject of Puvis de Chavannes' La Toilette, a woman that is preparing a wealthier woman's hair. We even get a child here. So it's another of those multi-figure Leonard-esque compositions. The color scheme is rather pale and fresco-like, like Puvis de Chavannes, who was very much admired at this moment in Paris. But Picasso is specifically vying with a work that the Steins already owned, a 1905 work by Henri Charles Mangin, who was one of the more progressive painters working in Paris at that time. And the Mangin has a female nude whose hair is being dressed by a clothed woman. So Picasso is drawing on these antecedents, also using the mirror as Titian and Rubens had made, and Velázquez had made images of beautiful women holding up mirrors. And unfortunately for Picasso, right about the time he was finishing the painting, the 1906 earthquake struck in San Francisco, and Michael and Sarah Stein had to hurry back to their home to check on their properties and their investments, and they were not able to purchase this painting. It eventually went to a different collector, but the following year, Matisse made his own version of La Coiffure. And again, he is working off of the Mangin, and he was painting this for Michael and Sarah. And unlike Picasso, Matisse sticks with the nude having her hair dressed. The two paintings are exactly the same size, and Matisse even borrowed the pink flower from the dresser in the background and placed it into the woman's hair, and also makes the attendant much older, gives her white or silver hair. Well, obviously, the Matisse is a much more radical painting than the Mangan, but it's also more radical than the Picasso in its simplification of form and color, its treatment of the human body. Picasso still looks a little conservative compared to this Matisse. Matisse was also working in 3 dimensions in these years. He and Picasso would go back between sculpture and painting for most of their careers. And this is a reclining nude, a little figurine that I'm showing you 2 views of because they look a little weird in some angles. It almost looks in some angles like that thigh is not connected to the rest of the nude. There's almost a sense of dislocation to that hip. And the first version of this reclining nude, the original statuette, fell and broke. And so Matisse decided he needed to memorialize it in a non-fragile material, and so painted this blue nude, souvenir of Biskra, North Africa, where Matisse had visited. So he is still very interested in Cézanne, in that figure-ground relationship, in the somewhat awkward angles of the human figure. But this work, again, scandalized the critics. They saw it as hideously ugly. And Picasso, too, first claimed he was not interested in this work, telling an American art student, quote, "If he wants to make a woman, let him make a woman. If he wants to make a design, let him make a design. This is between the two," end quote. However, Picasso was formulating his response, which was this, and again, we've got the Ariadne elbow of the nude in the sculpture as well. So Picasso responds with his blue nude, a painting in which the model's face is now blue. And this may be the work that marks the turning point between Picasso and Matisse in terms of who would take the lead as the more radical artist. Because this is although this was reviled by the critics, at least it has some sense of roundness, of identifiable plant forms and so forth, a sense of mass and volume. This does not, and this is much stranger than Matisse's blue nude. Picasso takes this same figure and repeats it in his major Dance of the Veil. So this work is only 26 inches high. This one is 5 feet high. And the pose is almost identical, except that here, taking his aesthetic from the African masks that he is spending time at the ethnographic museum at the Trocadero in Paris studying, he creates this very shocking figure for 1907 that is made up of lines and what seem like cross-hatchings, which in Western drawing adds a sense of volume, but here seem purely decorative. They seem to add to a sense almost of flatness here. The veils, instead of being floaty, are weirdly crystallized in a very hard-edged way. And while Picasso makes this, he is doing dozens and dozens of studies for a major work that is going to be Picasso's response not just to the blue nude, but also to the joy of life. His Demoiselles d'Avignon. So Picasso is plotting a brothel scene that originally contained two male figures who would be eliminated from the final version. Picasso's famous Demoiselles d'Avignon, considered by some critics the most important painting of the 20th century. Picasso is using that lesson about clashing artistic styles in a single work of art and doing that on a much larger scale than he ever had before. So we have the two nudes in the center with their Matissean joy of life poses, but with those Iberian faces, with the almond-shaped eyes. We have the slightly more conservative nude on the left, maybe not. And then the most astonishing were the two on the right, whose faces have been replaced by African masks. They're quite close to examples that Picasso saw in the Ethnographic Museum. There's again some of that weird crystallized drapery that's borrowed from Cezanne and El Greco. There is a still life, but that is perhaps the most dangerous slice of melon in the entire Western canon. The nude at the upper right, Picasso has given a reversible cube for a breast. So it's that strange diamond shape that we might read as projecting or receding. The scariest of all is the crouching nude in the lower right-hand corner, who may or may not be sitting on a bidet and who may or may not be facing us. We have the impression that her head is turned 180 degrees on her neck. This is an incredibly violent painting. Picasso is doing violence to the human figure here, to the tradition of Western art. He's taking Cezanne in a much more radical direction than Matisse was willing to travel, and using African art in a way that Matisse was unwilling to consider. In fact, Matisse hated this painting, but so did the rest of the art world. One of Picasso's friends predicted that they would find Picasso driven to suicide by this work. They thought he was going mad. And so he rolled it up. He took it off the stretcher, rolled it up, put it away. But he is creating, in a way, the opposite of the joy of life. This painting that is all about sensuality and curves and dance and music and nature. This painting is about fear of venereal disease, about threatening female sexuality. This is really the terror of life as opposed to the joy of life. But Picasso manages to convince some of Matisse's former followers and tempt them onto his road. So it's 1907, late 1907, when Braque creates his response to Matisse's blue nude. Like Picasso's, Braque's is vertical and has a lot of blue. But this is Braque switching camps. Braque had started, and even earlier in 1907 was still painting as a fauve. Someone in Matisse's camp with those brilliant colors and the pointillism. The same goes for André Derain and Maurice de Vlaminck. All three of them had started as adherents of Matisse. All three of them defected to Picasso. And all three of them were apparently present in Picasso's studio in 1907 when Matisse and Picasso exchanged pictures in a gesture of mutual esteem or something. Gertrude Stein would later say that each artist picked the worst work by the other artist so that they could laugh at it. But that is not a thoughtful comment. Instead, it is quite far from the truth. We don't know how they chose these works. We don't know what the process was. We can imagine them in each other's studios looking at various possibilities. But these were the two that they exchanged in Picasso's studio with Derain and Vlaminck and Braque looking on. And Picasso received a portrait of Matisse's daughter on the right, which is an homage to a painting by Picasso of a few years earlier. Matisse saw this painting shortly after it was completed in 1901, the year in which Marguerite, his daughter, had a very serious throat operation. In fact, he in his memory, this painting and her surgery were somewhat conflated. And so a few years later, when he would paint Marguerite with the black ribbon that she would wear around her neck to hide the tracheotomy scar from that operation, he is drawing on the Pere Monash. They both have a similar color scheme. They both have the name of the sitter written in the upper left. But Picasso felt that with this painting, Matisse was using the fact that his boys were beginning to learn to draw, and he was able to call on his children's drawings. Because Picasso would say, many years later, attending an exhibition of children's drawings, he would say that he could never have been in that exhibit because at 8, he already drew like Raphael. And added, it took me years to learn to draw like a child. And in fact, around 1907, Picasso is trying to expunge that facility of his, that almost inborn ability to draw like Raphael in works like this. So in choosing the Marguerite, this is a work that he feels is drawn like a child, has a childlike feel to it. Matisse got pitcher, bowl, and lemon, a work whose brilliant colors are rather Matisse-like. But here again, there is a personal significance. A year earlier, or not quite, Matisse was attacked in the press for this still life. The critic wrote, quote, "A lemon is not flat, Monsieur Matisse." And yet Picasso's lemon is much flatter. than anything Matisse had painted up to this time. Cézanne, of course, was a great painter of still lives, and both Picasso and Matisse are drawing on Cézanne in their still lives, and Matisse also drawing much more than Picasso on ornament, on textile patterns. Now, at the end of 1907, Matisse painted the painting on the left, Luxury one, and then he repeated it, simplifying it, consolidating the colors, a practice that he would do with a number of works around this time. Of course, Picasso is looking at this work that draws on the classical trope of the three graces, and Picasso will respond with his three women who seem primordial, as if they are emerging from carved earth almost. The one in the back, the least well-formed, the two in the foreground beginning to be more sculptural in feeling. So he's taking the language of parts of the Demoiselles d'Avignon and creating a new visual language in which foreground and background are becoming hard to distinguish. Well, Matisse looks at three women and responds with one of his most disturbing paintings, Bathers with a Turtle. Again, three women, three graces, but the figure in the center is so strange. Her hands are to her mouth, just like that African figurine, and her face is strange, ill-formed, almost grotesque. And we know that at this time Picasso had a turtle as a pet, but we don't know if this turtle is a reference to that fact. So here we can see that Matisse is clearly differentiating foreground from background. The background are these simplified planes of color, but they're definitely not figure, whereas Picasso responds with a work that merges the two even further. Another meditation on Matisse's blue nude, on the woman with the arms over her head, where there seem to be areas of energy in what we imagine is the background, but it's really rather difficult to parse out in places of this work what is figure and what is ground. Now, this was disturbing work, and Matisse was pulling away from it in works like Harmony in Red, where he's using that same tablecloth we saw in his still life, which was white and blue. He's migrating it onto the wall as well, and then unifying the whole with that raspberry color. And this is a painting that has almost everything. It doesn't have a nude, but it has a female figure. It's got still life. It's got landscape in what may be a window or maybe a painting. It's very, very flat. It even has Van Gogh's chair, another nod to a favorite artist. But Matisse was having difficulties in his marriage at this point and painted Conversation, a work in which the two figures seem to be almost bristling with unspoken tension, and the grille of the decorative wrought iron window balcony practically spells out the French word non, N-O-N, or no in French. This is not a comfortable painting. And yet, by this time, Matisse has made his famous or perhaps infamous remark that he wanted his works to be like a soothing armchair for a mental worker, a professor or a businessman to come home to after a long day. Now, Picasso, like Matisse, was looking at Cézanne, but he was focusing on different aspects. He was looking at how Cézanne constructs his canvases through little bits of color, of hatching, little areas that almost look like little cubes. And in 1908, both Braque and Picasso were doing a deep dive into Cézanne and what they could glean from Cézanne. So Braque, who begins his career as a fauve in Matisse's camp, radically shifts here and paints this houses at a stock. And it's said that Matisse was sitting on a jury in 1908 that Braque submitted, an art jury, that Braque submitted this work to. And Matisse apparently commented, the cubes, always the little cubes, thereby naming Cubism. Braque and Picasso are working almost in lockstep at this moment in their careers, constantly in one another's studios, bouncing ideas off of one another. Picasso wanted to create an art that was more impersonal, more anonymous, more like a science, something that took the visible world apart in an almost clinical way. Here, he's taking apart his lover Fernand's head, giving her one of those reversible cubes right in the middle of her forehead, and more cubes for her eyes. There's a Cézanne-like still life in the background. Picasso would create a sculpture of this as well, going back and forth, as Matisse did, between 2 and 3 dimensions. But Matisse was not interested in the little cubes. He was, at this moment, channeling the Dionysian energies of the dance and music in works for his great patron, Sergei Shukin, in Moscow. And this, in fact, when he first saw this, Shukin decided to buy a nice, safe Puvis de Chavannes instead. But on the train ride on the way home, he wrote to Matisse and said, I was wrong. You are so far ahead of the rest of us that it takes us a bit to catch up. And so he purchased this work, and Matisse did a very generous thing. Shukin was his major source of financial support at this point in his career, his number one patron. Here he is. And Matisse introduced him to Picasso. And so Shukin also became an important collector of Picasso, buying, for instance, this very cubist clarinet and violin. Picasso, by 1910, is entering the phase that art historians call analytic cubism. And this is an unfinished painting from that phase. You can see that he has almost eliminated color. He's limited his palette to browns and grays, and that he begins with a human figure. And we can see that this is a girl with a a nude with a mandolin. But had he finished this painting, it probably would have ended up looking much more like Ma Jolie, because this is a finished analytical cubist painting, in which you cannot tell if it is a guitar or a zither that the putative woman is playing here. Even finding the woman is quite a challenge. So these are extremely novel works in the history of art. Picasso said he was getting rid of everything that people loved about Impressionism. The colors, the sensations, the images of everyday life, but he insisted that he was still painting visible reality. He was just kind of deconstructing it and reconstructing it in a sort of a grid pattern that covers the entire canvas with no more interest in the middle than in the corners. And he's taking reality and making it into facets. So if you look at me, I'm at a number of different planes from you. And Picasso was taking, this and making that a plane, and this, and that's a little bit that way, and this one's that way, and maybe the, no skirt here, but, in as the skirt goes in, that's another plane. And each of those planes, he is treating like a form with shade to create this sense that this is not flat, but that it has lots and lots of dimension to it. Very, very different from, Matisse. Picasso in 1912 is already getting a little bored of analytical cubism, so he invents collage and starts to use actual materials like the rope that surrounds this still life, and the chair caning, which is not actually wicker, but decorator's fabric printed to look like chair caning. And the rest looks basically like an analytic cubist painting. So Picasso is doing this. Meanwhile, Matisse is looking at Persian miniatures. He travels to Germany to see an enormous show of Islamic art, and he's fascinated by the busyness of the Persian miniature, by all of these different colors and textures and decorative motifs. And so he is making paintings that have this sort of riot of colors and textures and visual decorative motifs. And this gets to be a bit much, perhaps. So he paints the Red Studio, where instead of all of that riot of ornament, he simply used red as a unifying color for everything in this painting that isn't a work of art or a living creature, that nasturtium. And in fact, when Picasso was feeling the limitations of Cubism, we see him starting to lean towards Matisse again. In his Guitar, Sheet Music, and Glass, the first collage where he uses an actual piece of newspaper to say le jeu, the background is wallpaper. And the colors are brighter, and it looks much more Matisse-like. And in 1913, this guitar and violin has, again, more color than analytic cubism. We've got blues and greens in this image, and those swirls, those decorative motifs that look like they could have come from Matisse. Matisse, meanwhile, was visiting his patron in Moscow and soaking up the Byzantine icons, the Russian icons, in collections there, and then goes to Morocco, where he paints essentially Russian icons, these tall figures that are so imposing, but so brilliant in their colors and so playing card flat, still for his patron, Sergei Shukin. He would come back and paint his studio with a goldfish, in which he's painting again his own artworks, a couple of his Morocco paintings on the wall in the background, the nude statuette there in the foreground. And this is a brilliant work of modern art, but it is more conservative than this is. Picasso's 1912 bottle on a table. That is essentially a few lines of charcoal, the minimalist grid, and some actual newspaper. Matisse was painting portraits in Morocco that, by the standards of 5 years earlier, would have earned him another model with, instead of the green stripe, maybe half of the face painted green, as this powerful seated Riffian has so much green in his features. But again, compared to an analytic cubist portrait, it's still much more conventional, much more recognizable in Matisse than it is in Picasso. Now, in 1913, Picasso painted this rather bizarre portrait of Amélie, where her features are mask-like. Her eyes are blank, black ovals. And this is a moment where Matisse is flirting both with Cubism and with Picasso himself. Because in August of 1913, both Matisse and Picasso sent brief postcards to Gertrude Stein saying almost exactly the same thing. Picasso wrote, quote, "Matisse and I are going horseback riding." End quote. Matisse wrote, quote, "Picasso is a horseman. We're going out riding. It amazes a lot of people." End quote. And indeed, it did amaze a lot of people that these two men who had been identified as heads of antagonistic camps, were suddenly having this rapprochement. And I forgot to mention this, but I think this was where we have the Marguerite. It's farther back than I thought. There. So Matisse learns in 1912 that Picasso's friends are throwing darts at this portrait. They were suction cup darts, so they weren't the kind that, they weren't putting holes in it, but this is not a still life. They were throwing darts at Matisse's daughter, and he was furious when this leaked out. And Picasso later expressed shame that he had not stepped in to stop this. But this is a moment in 1912 when Picasso's band, as they were known, Brock and Duran and Vlaminck, they were out graffitiing anti-Matisse slogans on walls in Montmartre, like "Matisse causes madness" and "Matisse has done more harm than war." So the fact that a year later the two are going horseback riding together was astonishing to a lot of people. So we saw Picasso looking at Matisse, and we see Matisse now looking at Picasso, scratching out what had originally been quite a lovely portrait of Amélie, giving her those caricatural eyebrows and so forth. But as radical as this is for Matisse, it cannot touch Picasso. This is a Picasso head in 1913. Picasso, however, was suffering in this period. His lover, Eva Guel, the Ma Jolie of the earlier paintings, was dying of cancer in a sanitarium. In fact, she would die a few weeks after, went too forward, after Picasso finished this portrait of her. This really painful portrait where there are breasts just hanging. We don't know exactly what Ava's diagnosis was, but this painting makes us think mastectomy. The way he paints those breasts. No face. Just, yeah. And she's sitting in an armchair. And it's been suggested that Picasso may have been thinking about that comment of Matisse's, Matisse saying he wanted his art to be like a comfortable armchair. Picasso was making sure that this armchair is not in the least comfortable. After Ava's death, Picasso would paint another Ma Jolie. Here, taking up pointillism, that areas of this are done with the dot that Matisse was using a few years earlier. And we see, again, the harlequin pattern that stands in for Picasso himself. Picasso was looking for a way to come out of Cubism, and Matisse was getting, at the beginning of World War I, the closest, the most engaged with Cubism that he would be ever. So you wouldn't know it from this painting of Notre Dame, but immediately after completing this painting, Matisse paints this. Stripping it down to its elements in the way that Picasso and Braque would. He's still using more color than they did, and he's using much broader planes and those little facets that Picasso used. They would have fractured this into a lot more pieces, but he was looking very hard at Cubism and Cubism's restructuring of the world, a world that in 1914 looked violent and nihilistic. Matisse also painted this goldfish and palette in the same year. It originally included a self-portrait, but he painted it out, leaving just a palette in the center right with a thumb. So you can imagine where Matisse would have been standing on the right, but he eliminated himself. And the goldfish are just slashes of orange rimmed with black, in fact, quite reminiscent of that lemon in the Picasso painting that Matisse had traded for. This is a bleak painting, as is the Notre Dame. And a few months later, Matisse would see a work that Picasso had begun working on when Ava was ill and had finished after her death in 1915. It is a harlequin, which also has a palette, or maybe a canvas, in the center right. The harlequin is certainly Picasso, the image of the painter who is now alone, but is seeing himself as a sort of split personality, so much so that the face is literally split into black and white. Matisse thought this was one of the most powerful things Picasso had ever painted, but he insisted that Picasso owed it all to Matisse's goldfish and palette. And indeed, Picasso had looked closely at this painting. But this is Picasso looking at Matisse, and in Matissean fashion, it is utterly flat. And this work, which includes that pointillism, is from what critics would call Picasso's Rococo Cubist style, which includes, again, some of the color and some of the decorative flourishes we associate more with Picasso, or with Matisse. And Matisse is looking at Picasso. Picasso is looking at Matisse. Picasso would say later, quote, "You have got to be able to picture side by side everything Matisse and I were doing at that time. No one has ever looked at Matisse's painting more carefully than I, and no one has looked at mine more carefully than he," end quote. It's as if at times they were painting solely for one another. After the war, Matisse would enter his Nice phase, largely preoccupied with the odalisque theme. Fake harem girls in exotic textiles with backgrounds hung with Islamic-style fabric. These were seen by many as a retrenchment from the radical images he had created at the outset of the Great War. Picasso, too, would retrench and create works in a much more classical style. But the two artists continued to be extremely important touchpoints for one another for the rest of their lives. Matisse would send oranges to Picasso every year for Christmas. He'd first done so when Ava was in the sanitarium, and he continued the tradition for years. And in 1942, Picasso purchased this painting, Matisse's basket of oranges from his Morocco trip 30 years earlier, but he hung it proudly in his studio as this memory of those oranges that came every year, telling his companion, Françoise Gillot, quote, "Matisse and I have to talk as much as we can. When he is gone, there will be things I can talk about with no one else," end quote. And after Matisse died in 1954, Picasso took up Matisse's favorite theme, doing a series of variations on The Women of Algiers in Their Apartment by Delacroix, which both Matisse and Picasso admired tremendously. Although you'll note that in Picasso's reworking of it, it features the Matisse blue nude with the elbows over the head, those that he had first borrowed so many years ago. He said overtly, quote, "Matisse is no longer here, so I have to paint the odalisque." Throughout the long years of their careers, the two artists covered areas that were often similar. They were preoccupied with the human figure, with sensuality, with the making of art itself, and ultimately with their own places in posterity. And these two giants of 20th century painting stirred one another to their greatest achievements. It's hard to imagine what the canvas of modern painting would have looked like if one or the other had been missing. Thank you. So I apologize, as usual, I have gone a bit long, but I am happy to take questions if there are questions, or we can go back to any image you'd like a second look at.
Excuse me.
Rebecca, was there a painting in there from the collection of tennis player Andrei Rublev?
Was there?
I saw his name.
Andrei
Rublev.
There may well have been. I did not know that was a tennis player, which gives you an idea of my tennis knowledge.
There,
So this is, I don't know if it's if this is when was this person a tennis player?
Now.
No, because if he's in his 20s or 30s now?
Yeah, late 20s. Late 20s.
I think this collection was started earlier than that. I think this collection of early Russian art was it's possible it was his father who collected this art. I don't think Andrei Rublev is a really unusual Russian name. So I'm pretty sure that this is not related, well, is not directly collected by the tennis player. That this collection would have been started maybe even before his birth. I've heard of Nadal. Yes, please. We've got it.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you, John. Interpretation of the four women, you described it as violence. Do you know which?
So I think we are in, yeah, there we go. Demoiselles d'Avignon. There are actually 5 women here. And yes, I described it as violent.
Okay. And can you tell me how you got to that point?
How I got to this point. Picasso is not respecting the bodily autonomy of these women. He's violently imposing African masks instead of heads, creating these kind of hybrid chimera-like creatures in the 2 women on the right. That woman, the sort of crouching woman, looks as if her back is to us. And yet she also looks like she's staring straight out at us like the child in The Exorcist. There are just ways in which this does violence to these 5 bodies, and also to the whole tradition of painting the nude, of painting and just even that Matisse. But this, the Mangan is more in the tradition of painting the female nude, which is recognizable as a body, as flesh, as a source of desire. And when Picasso paints the Demoiselles d'Avignon, they're no longer, they are threatening us. Their gaze is challenging us. They are not spreading themselves out to be enjoyed by the male viewer, as was the case of so much previous art, depictions of the female nude. They're slashing. I see them as doing violence to the body and to the tradition. Yeah. Yes.
You didn't make any mention of the things of Matisse's old age when his fingers weren't working, and he did collages and things with.
Yes, and I love that stage of Matisse's art. But obviously, I had more than I could fit as it was. And there's a way in which those paintings are Matisse's most abstract works. And they are works, some of them at least, like The Snail, which is in the Tate Modern in London. They're works that are very aware of Cubism, and in their own way, using a variation of the language of Cubism. And they're brilliant. The colors are gorgeous. They're fabulous. Matisse's late cutouts. Someday I will do a whole talk on them. They appear in a talk that I have given here. It was a few years back about artists in their old age, where I talked about those works. But I talked about a number of artists and how Renoir as well couldn't hold a paintbrush late in his career because of rheumatoid arthritis. Georgia O'Keeffe goes blind, so does Degas, and so forth. But yeah, I love Matisse's cutouts. This is sort of an homage to those. They just didn't fit in this talk. Other questions? No? Well, thank you all so much.